The air inside the county courthouse was thick with tension. It was the kind of late summer morning when the sun beat down through the high windows, casting long golden rays across the polished floor. Everyone in the room seemed to know that something was about to happen, though none of them could have predicted just how unforgettable it would become. At the back of the room, an elderly woman sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dark blue dress, though simple, was immaculately pressed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a bun, and a delicate pair of glasses rested low on her nose. She looked out of place among the suits and ties and hurried whispers, like a relic from another time. That woman was Margaret Ellis, a widow who had lived most of her life in silence after the sudden death of her husband, Judge Thomas Ellis, a man once respected throughout the state for his fairness and humility. Few people recognized her now. Time had faded her name and face from the public memory. Margaret had come that day not as a witness, not as a defendant, and certainly not as someone the others expected to play a role in the proceedings. She was just there to observe, or so they thought. The courtroom bustled with young lawyers and ambitious clerks, each too busy to notice the quiet presence in the back row. What none of them knew was that this humble widow, dressed in navy and pearls, was not just attending out of interest. She had been summoned in secrecy. There was a file in the judge's chamber marked with her initials, and by the end of the day that file would bring every assumption crashing down. The bailiff called the room to order, and the murmurs faded into an uneasy silence. Judge Raymond Kessler, a tall man with a sharp chin and colder eyes, entered with a rustle of black robes. He carried himself with the kind of authority that came not from respect, but from fear, the type of man who had long since stopped listening to people who looked beneath him. At the bench, he adjusted his microphone and looked down over the courtroom with the air of someone surveying a battlefield he already believed he had conquered. "Let's proceed," he said without emotion. "State of Missouri versus Anita Rhodes." A young black woman in her early 30s stood shakily as her name was called. Anita wore a pale blouse and slacks that didn't quite fit, as if she had borrowed them. Her hands trembled as she stood next to a thin public defender who seemed barely out of law school. Judge Kessler's tone turned condescending almost instantly. "Miss Rhodes, I've reviewed the summary. You claim to be the legal heir to property once owned by the late Judge Thomas Ellis." "Yes, Your Honor," Anita replied, voice shaking. "My grandmother worked for the Ellises for years. Judge Ellis, he promised—" "That's enough," Kessler interrupted. "Promises are not deeds. You do understand how property law works?" A few people in the courtroom chuckled softly, mostly junior attorneys seated in the gallery. Anita looked down, ashamed, her face flushing with embarrassment. Margaret watched from the back, her lips pressed together. Her fingers clutched the small leather purse in her lap. Her eyes had not left Judge Kessler once. She recognized him, of course. He had once clerked under her late husband, a student of the law who had clearly forgotten everything his mentor had tried to teach him. Margaret's mind was racing, not with anger but with resolve. The very file that would change the outcome of this trial was still in her possession, just as her husband had requested in his final letter. She knew her moment had not come yet, but it would. And when it did, Judge Kessler would learn the true meaning of justice, not the kind that parades in front of a gavel, but the kind that walks silently in pearls and knows the whole truth. As the courtroom settled into a pause between cases, Margaret Ellis stood. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from age and anticipation. She made her way slowly toward the front, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile floor. All eyes turned toward her, some with curiosity, others with annoyance. Judge Kessler looked up from his notes and raised an eyebrow. "Yes, ma'am," he asked, already sounding impatient. "I request to speak on the matter of the Ellis estate," Margaret said gently, her voice steady despite the weight of memory behind it. Kessler gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "And you are?" "My name is Margaret Ellis, widow of the late Judge Thomas Ellis." There was a slight stir in the room. Even the court clerk glanced up at that. Kessler's smile faltered for half a second, then returned with a condescending edge. "Well, Mrs. Ellis," he said, emphasizing her name as if to disarm her, "this matter concerns the legal estate, not family sentiments." "I believe I have documents relevant to the ownership of the disputed property," she continued, her hand reaching into her purse. "Mrs. Ellis," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "We are not accepting evidence from the gallery. If you wish to submit documents, you'll need to go through the appropriate legal channels." "But," Kessler cut her off again. "Ma'am, unless you are an attorney representing the claimant or the estate, I must ask you to return to your seat." Laughter rippled through the room. One of the younger attorneys in the gallery muttered under his breath, "Someone should explain court protocol to Grandma." Margaret's face flushed slightly, but she did not look away. She looked directly at Kessler, holding his gaze with quiet defiance. He leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated. "Bailiff," he said casually, "please escort Mrs. Ellis back to her seat. We need to maintain order." The bailiff, a younger man who seemed almost apologetic, approached her. "Ma'am, please, this way." Margaret didn't resist. She simply nodded, adjusted the strap of her purse, and returned to the back of the room. But in that moment something shifted. A few people who had chuckled now looked down in silence. They had seen not just an old woman, but a figure of dignity denied her voice. Margaret sat quietly, hands folded, eyes unwavering. She knew they had just made a terrible mistake. The next case proceeded, but a subtle tension lingered in the air. Margaret Ellis sat silently at the back of the courtroom, her posture composed, her eyes following every word exchanged between the attorneys and the judge. Though she had been dismissed, she did not look defeated. She looked patient. A middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit, seated a few rows ahead of her, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Did she say Thomas Ellis?" The colleague frowned. "You mean the Thomas Ellis, the one who used to preside over the state Supreme Court?" The man gave a slight nod. "She said she's his widow." Their eyes shifted to the back of the room. Suddenly Margaret no longer appeared as just an old woman with a soft voice. She was someone with history, someone who had once stood beside power. Behind them, a young intern working for the district clerk quickly searched for Thomas Ellis on his phone, then turned pale. He glanced at the elderly woman again, now processing what others had begun to whisper. "She's not just any widow," the intern muttered. "She's that widow." At the bench, Judge Kessler continued with the next case, unaware that a shift had begun behind him. As he read off property figures and legal statements, his own court staff exchanged uncertain glances. One of the clerks, an older woman who had worked in the judiciary for over 20 years, turned toward a junior assistant and said, "That woman used to attend every major legal gala with her husband. She was known across the entire circuit." The assistant blinked. "And Judge Kessler just had her escorted out?" The clerk shook her head slowly. "Not just escorted, silenced." Meanwhile, Margaret sat quietly, as if unaware of the stir her name had caused. But in truth, she could feel the change. Her late husband's legacy had always cast a long shadow, and though she never wielded it for attention, it had a way of reappearing when least expected. One of the younger lawyers walked toward the exit during a recess, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, it's Margaret Ellis. I'm telling you, she was in the courtroom just now." And Judge Kessler had no idea. He had her dismissed like some stranger off the street. A pause, then his voice dropped lower. "This won't stay quiet. Not when people find out who she is." Margaret watched him leave, then turned her gaze forward again. The courtroom was beginning to remember a name it should never have forgotten. By the time the court session paused for its afternoon break, the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones. Those who had once ignored the elderly woman now eyed her with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Margaret remained seated at the back. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged. But her eyes were sharp, quietly scanning the courtroom. She had spent years beside her husband, watching him navigate legal mazes, cross-examine dishonest officials, and argue precedent with unwavering calm. This was not unfamiliar ground. This was once her world. As others filed out for coffee and air, Margaret slowly reached into her handbag. From a folded section at the bottom, she pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges but carefully preserved. Her fingers brushed over the handwritten label on the front, "To be opened only if they forget who you are." It was Thomas's handwriting. Even now, the sight of it made her heart clench. She had never shown the letter to anyone, not after the funeral, not during the years of silence and solitude, not even when their family name slowly faded from legal memory. But today something in her shifted. With delicate care she opened the envelope. Inside, on a crisp sheet of paper, was a short note, just one paragraph, Thomas's words, direct and powerful as ever. To whom it may concern, if this letter finds its way into a court of law, then someone has forgotten the legacy of integrity I once stood for. My wife, Margaret Ellis, holds the rights to all documents, trusts, and sealed instructions I left behind upon my death. She is not a guest in any courtroom. She is the keeper of every secret I did not write into my judgments. Respect her as you once respected me. Thomas A. Ellis, former Chief Justice. Margaret exhaled softly, her eyes wet with memory but not sadness. She folded the letter again, placed it back into her handbag, and rose from her seat. As she walked down the aisle of the courtroom, heads turned. Conversations stopped. The security guard who had once ignored her now opened the door without being asked. She did not look at anyone directly. She did not need to. Her presence now said everything. Margaret was no longer the woman in the corner. She was the storm they never saw coming. Margaret walked with quiet determination through the marble corridors, her shoes echoing softly with every step. A bailiff tried to stop her near the side hallway, but when she raised her hand slightly and mentioned her name, his expression changed immediately. He stepped back, said nothing, and pointed toward the judge's chambers. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, each spine etched with golden legal codes. A large wooden desk sat near the window, and behind it Judge Whitman stood, removing his robe and sipping from a delicate china cup. He didn't hear her at first. "Judge Whitman," Margaret said softly. He turned, startled. The cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, surprised. "I didn't expect—" "No one ever does," she interrupted gently. "Especially when a woman walks in without shouting." He looked confused for a moment. "Are you here about the real estate settlement? I understand your testimony was—" "I'm not here to testify," she said, setting her handbag down on the desk. From it she withdrew the folded letter. Judge Whitman recognized the handwriting instantly, his face drained of color. "That's Thomas's handwriting," he murmured. Margaret nodded. The judge sat down slowly, scanning the letter. Every word he read seemed to strip away layers of practiced detachment. By the time he finished, he looked at her with new eyes. "Why didn't you bring this earlier?" Margaret took a seat opposite him, her voice calm. "Because I never thought I would need to. I believed that dignity still had weight. That presence meant something, but I was wrong. They laughed. They dismissed me. They forgot who built the foundation of this place." He lowered the letter to the desk, rubbing his forehead. "I remember your husband," he said. He taught me to cross-reference case law. He told me once, the courtroom is not a theatre, but actors still show up. I suppose today I played one." Margaret looked out the window for a moment. "He trusted you," she said softly. "And he warned me that one day someone might forget." Judge Whitman stood again, a deep breath rising from his chest. "Leave this with me," he said. "I will recall the court. I will correct the record." "No," Margaret said, surprising him. "I will. This courtroom silenced me once. They need to hear me now." A pause passed between them. Then the judge gave a short nod. "As you wish." When Margaret turned to leave, he spoke again. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. She stopped. "Thank you for reminding me what justice looks like." Margaret did not answer. She simply opened the door and stepped back into the hall, carrying with her not just the letter, but the memory of a man whose name still had the power to bend a courtroom back toward truth. The courtroom was already buzzing when Margaret returned. Spectators whispered, glancing at the doors as though something unusual were about to happen. On the bench, Judge Whitman had resumed his seat, but his expression had changed. The stiffness in his posture was gone. Instead, there was a look of gravity in his eyes, as though he had seen something sacred and now carried the burden of restoring its place. Margaret walked past the front rows, past the defense attorneys who still wore smirks of quiet dismissal. She stopped just in front of the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the bar. "Mrs. Ellis," the clerk began, "I believe we were done with witness testimonies." "Not quite," Judge Whitman interrupted, his voice steady. "Mrs. Ellis has the floor. Let the record show that this court is reconvening to hear a final statement." Everyone sat straighter. Margaret stepped through the gate, past the lawyers, and stood facing the courtroom. Her posture was calm, her voice unshaken. "I was dismissed earlier not for what I said, but for what I looked like," she began. "A woman in mourning clothes, quiet, older, without title or power. I was told this courtroom had no use for me, but it seems that silence was mistaken for weakness." She took out the letter, and held it gently in her hands. "My husband, Thomas Ellis, may be gone, but he left behind more than a name. He left instructions, legal ones. He left ownership, power of discretion. He left me the authority that many of you thought I could never hold." A stunned silence swept through the room. One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Another began to whisper rapidly to a junior associate. Margaret continued, "This building we sit in, the very courthouse you occupy, was renovated 5 years ago thanks to a personal donation. The plaque in the hallway names a foundation. What it does not say is that the fund came from my husband's private estate." She stepped closer to the bench. "He did not want recognition, he wanted justice, and he warned me that the day might come when this place would forget. Today you forgot." Gasps rippled through the audience. The gallery, which moments ago had been filled with condescending stares, now leaned in with reverent silence. Judge Whitman nodded slowly. "Let the record reflect that this court acknowledges the documentation provided by Mrs. Ellis. It has been verified and will be entered into evidence. The prior objection to her presence is hereby stricken from the record." The smug attorney from earlier looked pale. Margaret took a step back, but not before locking eyes with the young lawyer who had tried to remove her earlier. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of what had just occurred said it all. As she walked back toward the gallery, the room remained still. There was no applause, no cheers, only a shared realization that something profound had just taken place. The humble widow they had dismissed had just reminded them all what it meant to carry dignity and truth without raising a voice. Outside the courtroom, news had already begun to spread. A few reporters who had caught wind of Margaret Ellis's sudden return had started posting cryptic headlines. "Widow's surprise statement halts court proceedings. Who is Mrs. Ellis, and why did the judge stand for her?" Cameras were beginning to gather outside the courthouse, unaware that inside a storm of reckoning had only just begun. Back inside, the mood shifted. Gone was the smug confidence of the defense team. Gone were the quiet chuckles and offhand comments from court officers who had once looked past Margaret like she was just another passerby. Now they watched her with uncertainty, even a hint of respect, unsure what else she might reveal. Judge Whitman called a brief recess, but no one moved. Margaret sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded over her lap. Emily returned to her side, her voice barely a whisper. "You did it, Margaret. You turned this whole room around." Margaret gave her a faint smile. "I didn't turn anything. I just reminded them that power doesn't always look the way they expect." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom doors, the senior attorney who had objected so harshly earlier paced in frustration. He hissed into his phone. "You didn't tell me she had a stake in the building. You didn't tell me her husband was the Ellis behind the renovations. If she has access to the estate files, we could be facing sanctions. This whole trial could fall apart." The voice on the other end offered no comfort. "I thought she was just a grieving widow," came the irritated reply. The attorney slammed his phone shut. In the courtroom hallway, Margaret was approached by a young intern from the opposing team. She looked no older than 22, her eyes wide, unsure of herself. She hesitated. "Mrs. Ellis, I just wanted to say, I think you were incredible in there." Margaret gave her a warm nod. "Then remember this moment, because one day someone will stand in front of you looking just like I did this morning, and you'll have a choice." The girl blinked, as if the weight of that sentence settled into her chest. Inside the courtroom, when the judge returned, he had an entirely different demeanor. His voice, once dry and procedural, carried a tone of deep respect. "This court recognizes the legal authority of Margaret Ellis, widow of Thomas Ellis and rightful custodian of his estate's civic holdings." The room stirred. The lawyer's notes rustled like leaves in a storm. A few mouths hung open. "As such," Judge Whitman continued, "her statements will be entered into the permanent record, and all prior dismissals are to be reviewed under the court's code of conduct." The courtroom was no longer in control of the attorneys. It was no longer just about legal motions or who had the sharper tongue. It was about truth. And everyone now knew that Margaret Ellis, the widow they had laughed at, had become the compass pointing them back toward justice. And outside, the press waited, unknowing that the most powerful voice in the courthouse was not the judge, not the lawyers, but a quiet woman in black who had once sat ignored in the back row. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky by the time court adjourned that day. Golden light filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. But inside Courtroom 3, the atmosphere felt lighter, as though something oppressive had finally been lifted. Margaret stood quietly as people began to file out. Many avoided her eyes, unsure whether to apologize, offer thanks, or simply acknowledge her presence now that they knew the truth. Others, like Emily, stayed close, silently proud. The judge stepped down from the bench and approached Margaret personally. His face, lined with years of authority and detachment, now carried something more human. "Mrs. Ellis," he said with a slight bow of the head, "I regret that I did not recognize your name sooner. I regret even more that I did not recognize your value as a person." Margaret nodded. "I'm used to being unseen, Your Honor, but I won't pretend it doesn't sting." He paused, then said softly, "I hope we can do better moving forward." Emily helped Margaret gather her things. As they walked into the hallway, the once silent staff now parted like a sea. People who had laughed, rolled their eyes, or dismissed her just hours ago now stood awkwardly still, unsure what to say. Margaret walked past them without a word. Near the courthouse steps, a small group of local reporters had formed. Cameras were pointed, mics extended. One brave journalist called out, "Mrs. Ellis, do you have any comment?" Margaret stopped. She turned to face the crowd, her voice clear and composed. "I'm not here for attention. I didn't speak today because I wanted a headline. I spoke because silence lets others believe we don't belong." The reporters held their microphones closer. "This building was donated by my husband and me. Not for profit, not for recognition, but so this city could have a place to pursue justice. And yet, when I walked through its doors as a widow, I was met with mockery, disrespect, dismissal." The murmurs quieted. "I share this not for pity. I share it as a reminder. People like me, older, quieter, dressed plainly, we built the very places you stand in today. And it's time we stop being treated like we don't matter." One of the journalists, moved by her words, lowered his camera. "Will you be attending tomorrow's session?" he asked. Margaret gave a small smile. "I'll be back, not for me, but for every woman who sat in silence thinking she had no power." With that, she turned and walked down the steps, her black coat flowing behind her. Emily followed beside her, shoulders high. That evening, Margaret sat at home alone for the first time in days. The light from this fireplace flickered gently across her face. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a photo of Thomas, smiling beside her on the steps of the same courthouse taken just a few years earlier. She looked at him for a long time and whispered, "They know now, and I think you would have been proud." The following week, a quiet change rippled through the courthouse. It wasn't announced on the news or posted in city bulletins, but for those who worked there every day, it was undeniable. People began speaking with more care. The receptionist who once rolled her eyes at Margaret now stood when older visitors approached. The young lawyer who laughed at her coat carried her case files with reverence. The judge requested an official plaque to be placed inside the entrance of the building. It read, "This courthouse was built with a gift from Thomas and Margaret Ellis, who believed that justice belongs to all, not only to those who dress the part." Underneath the plaque, a quote from Thomas was engraved in brass. "Power without compassion is nothing more than theatre." Margaret never asked for credit, but she saw the plaque on her next visit. She stood before it silently, her fingers brushing the edge of her husband's name. In the weeks that followed, Emily visited her often. The once secret lawyer was no longer hiding. In fact, Emily had filed her first motion to open a legal aid clinic inside the courthouse, dedicated to serving low-income elders, especially widows and widowers. "They forget us," Emily said one afternoon as they shared tea in Margaret's sunlit kitchen. "But you reminded them." Margaret smiled, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. "They forget until they are us." News of the courtroom incident, though not widely publicized, made its way through community channels. People began to whisper not about scandal, but about strength. The story of the quiet widow who stood her ground became something of a parable, passed from neighbor to neighbor. In a nearby high school civics class, a teacher printed out the court transcript and asked her students to read it aloud. "Who here thinks this woman would be powerful?" she asked, holding up a picture of Margaret in her long black coat. No hands were raised. Then the teacher nodded. "That's exactly why this matters." Back at home, Margaret opened her garden for the first time in years. She tended the roses Thomas once planted. Neighbors walked by and waved. Some brought homemade bread, others left thank you cards in the mailbox. A girl from the local elementary school left a small drawing that simply said, "You are brave." And though the city would eventually return to its routines, something in its rhythm had shifted. There was now a space for the quiet ones, for the humble, for those who had always been there but never truly seen. One morning, Margaret received a letter in the mail with a gold seal. It was from the mayor's office. It read, "Dear Mrs. Ellis, in light of recent events and in honor of your husband's legacy and your courage, we would like to formally invite you to speak at the city's annual Justice and Civic Honor event. Your voice, once overlooked, has become a symbol of what our city strives to be: inclusive, reflective, and just. With gratitude, Mayor Diane Richardson Margaret read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer next to Thomas's photo. She didn't need the spotlight, she never had. But that night when she stood at her window looking out into the soft glow of the city, she felt something different. Not vindication, not pride, peace, because she had proven something more powerful than any court ruling. That you do not need a gavel to deliver justice. You only need the courage to stand, especially when others sit.